Hello and welcome to another episode of the Capitol Record. I am your host, David Bonson, and I am excited to bring a National Review friend and colleague on the show again. We've done it several times, and as a matter of fact, last week we had Kevin Hazzard on, who is a fellow at National Review and has been on the podcast before, was our first ever guest on Capitol Record. But let's see, other National Review people over the years. I've had Andrew Studderford at Capitol Matters on a couple times. I've had Ramesh Paniro on a couple times. Daniel Tenrero was a former National Review writer who we had on a year and a half ago or so. But this is Dominic Pino's first time on Capitol Record. But Dominic is becoming one of the great writers in the National Review orbit, particularly at Capitol Matters. He was both an undergrad and grad student of economics at George Mason University, perhaps pound for pound, the finest economics learning institution in the country. Dominic is very, very bright, a great writer, and just someone I've really enjoyed reading, and it caused me to reach out and want to have him on the podcast. He's particularly interesting in some of his critique of the ESG movement. And he and I are just going to kind of go around the horn, talk about a lot of these issues and riff a bit. So without anything else to say here, I'm going to bring Dominic on the Capitol Record. So with that said, welcome to another Capitol Record, and welcome first-time guest and just wonderful contributor at National Review, Capitol Matters. Excited to hear his perspective on a lot of different things today. Dominic, welcome to Capitol Record.
Thanks so much, David. Thanks for having me. Excited to be on.
Well, it is my pleasure, and I'm glad to have a fellow National Review colleague on board. We've had a few National Review folks on before, and I think that there's a lot of listeners going to be excited to hear what you have to say. You've been doing a lot of writing for NR, and particularly in this field about ESG, and so I want to spend a lot of time kind of unpacking some of the things in the world we live in right now. Before I do, though, I would love for you to be able to maybe tell your story a little bit, who you are, where you came from, and let listeners get to know you a little better.
Sure. I'm initially from Wisconsin and moved out to Northern Virginia to go to George Mason University for college. I got my undergrad and master's degrees in economics from George Mason, and then have been at National Review, first as a summer intern, then as a Buckley Fellow, and now as the Thomas Rhodes Fellow in journalism. So it's been very good. You know, I work closely with Andrew Studderford on the Capitol Matters project, and making sure that we hold down the fort for free markets on the right.
Which is kind of the genesis of why this very podcast started. When you say hold down free markets for the right, it really wasn't started to defend free enterprise against some of the radical left. That kind of has to come with the territory. That's sort of a given. But the view that some forms of the right are maybe abandoning some of the first principles that undergird market economy is, I think, one of the big needs of the day. So I want to come back to that. I want to come back to ESG. But I want to talk about George Mason just for a minute. You did both your undergrad and master's work there. It sounds like you went to George Mason for the purpose of studying economics. You must have had a free market impulse even out of high school. Tell me a bit about that, and who some of your favorite teachers and classes were at George Mason.
Yeah, that's right, David. I was sort of introduced to George Mason through some of the prominent professors that write econ blogs about various topics. And so, Marginal Revolution with Tyler Cowen and Alex Tabarrok, and then Don Boudreaux with Cafe Hayek. And so that's how I sort of heard about it at first. Just started reading those in high school, and then got more interested in looking at the econ program. And it's really it's a one-of-a-kind econ department. I think it's great. They have a very well-rounded approach to economics. At some universities, it's just an applied math degree. But at Mason, it's very much we take ideas about political economy very seriously, and making sure that an econ graduate from Mason actually has a backing in the basics of microeconomics and macroeconomics, but also some philosophical background as well. And so, with microeconomics, Tom Ristisi was the definitely the top influence. He teaches principles of micro, and he's sort of the gatekeeper of the department that everyone has to get through. So he's very good at teaching the basics in a very memorable way. At the master's level, got a lot of my macro education from Garrett Jones. I was fortunate to take a class from Walter Williams before he passed away, and so I was very, very grateful to be able to learn from him as well. He was remarkable because, for all the rest of his career, right? Best-selling author, syndicated columnist, filling in for Rush Limbaugh. He's heard by tens of millions of people. In the classroom, he was just a teacher, and he took that really seriously, and was very, very good at it. And so that was quite impressive. Mark Koyama, I took a class from him on economic history. He's one of the top scholars working on that right now, and so it was, he is an encyclopedia. He knows everything about econ history, and it's really really great to hear from him. And then Dan Klein, who I co-edited a book with about Edmund Burke, and we worked on that project, and that came out of class with him. He teaches on Adam Smith a lot, and so he teaches a class where we just read Theory of Moral Sentiments from start to finish, and that was one of the top classes in college for sure. So yeah, there's so many different perspectives and different angles that people are coming at economic questions at George Mason, and it's great to be able to learn from as many of them as possible.
Now, you mentioned that the blogs of some of these more well-known blogs from some of the well-known professors helped attract you to George Mason. Marginal Revolution by Tyler and Cafe Hayek. What made you, at a younger age, presumably migrate to those blogs? What was sort of your introduction to, whether you were particularly focused on Austrian economics or just free market economics at large? What kind of started you in the field?
Yeah, I guess more just interested in free market economics in general. I think it was always sort of you sort of get this feeling that when you first start to wrap your mind around some basic economic concepts, that you have sort of special, like it's like a special ability to see how things work, right? And to try to just figure out like how these incredibly complex social interactions that most people just take for granted, that allow you to get food on the table and allow you to move around and allow you to, just so many different things. I think trying to understand those and then see how we can make those processes work better is just felt very, you never run out of things to look at with that. If you get bored by all of the complex interactions that are going on all around the world 24/7, you're just not paying attention. So I think that just the sort of bottomless nature of different questions that you can look at, but then also, the insight that you have then into how things work, just felt like a very useful thing to study.
Did you go to George Mason identifying as an Austrian? Did you leave George Mason identifying as an Austrian?
No, I don't. I wouldn't put that label on. I don't have anything against it per se, but no, I wouldn't identify that way. I think that the Austrian school has some really, really important insights, and a lot of them have been just adopted by economists in general. Whether there's basic ideas about marginalism, subjective theory of value. These are big things that came out of the Austrian school that basically all economists now accept today as being part of just sort of the body of economic knowledge. And so that's a huge part of economics. But uh, I think pretty much all schools, even schools that you might mostly disagree with, I think all of them have at least some contribution to make to economic knowledge, and even if it's learning from their failures, right? I think the experience of the 1970s with Keynesianism, for example, uh, there's a lot to learn there, even though even though even though it's mostly a story of what not to do. And so I think that all these different perspectives are good to think about, and I think increasingly it feels like identifying with a school is a much more 20th century thing. A lot of the top economists today tend not to do that, even when they're even if somebody else would look at it and say like, "Oh yeah, you're definitely part of this school." Um, Most of them wouldn't self-identify that way, and I think that's probably a smart thing. I think it's probably moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think I certainly agree about being able to learn from all schools. But I think that does seem to be more common now that people serious about improving their body of economic knowledge will often swim in a few different pools and yet come away with perhaps a greater awareness of what some of the differentiations or distinctions are, particularly philosophically, what might separate. I think like with monetary economics, some of the differences between Austrians and monetarists don't have to necessarily be as philosophical, where I think the general construct between Keynesians and Austrians, usually there's a more philosophical root to it. And yet, when you talk about policy, I think like supply siders, for example, are always a great example, a great illustration of the point I'm making, that we think of it as a school of thought. It was kind of a predominant, almost sort of policy orientation. But I know a lot of supply siders that identify as Austrian, and a lot who identify as Keynesian, and a lot who identify as monetarist. And there's not necessarily an intellectual inconsistency there. It could be a point of emphasis or something like that. And there also seems to have been kind of little civil wars within some of the camps. Definitely Keynesians are very divided about kind of the point of equilibrium at which, demand shocks are supposed to take place. And obviously we know within the Austrian school, there's been a whole lot of different splits, different camps and so forth. So like most things in organized society, I guess things take on different, flavors and divisions, and yet there can be, for the intellectually honest, still an underpinning of curiosity, which I actually view as one of the great takeaways from Friedrich Hayek, was that ongoing intellectual curiosity that was at a root of human action in a lot of ways.
For sure, and Hayek's point too about how there's a discovery process to building knowledge, and how that's like central to spontaneous order, but also just central to economic decision making, and that you're not coming in with this predefined set of rules, or your utility function that just is given and never changes. Part of the decision making process actually goes in and changes that, and I think we're seeing that too with the supply side label, actually, because for the longest time the left just attacked that as trickle down economics, or whatever pejorative they wanted to use. But we're now seeing a group of people on the left calling for supply side progressivism, which is sort of, I don't think they're I don't think they're right about some things, but I do think they are right, at least, to see the importance of supply side of things and the consequences of having an economy that's so heavily regulated that it's really difficult to build new things and start new ideas.
Was that term, did Janet Yellen say supply side progressivism, or did she say a modern supply side? What was her, the Secretary Yellen was one who kind of leaned into what you're talking about. And I don't remember her exact nomenclature, but it was something to that effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know it's been popular in some left-wing commentators. I think Matt Iglesias and a couple other people like that. But
and what they're basically getting at is acknowledgement that incentives matter.
Yeah.
But not so much focusing on incentives for productivity at the marginal rate, but rather on the using regulation to try to drive more green policies or other desired ends, socially, environmentally, whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the biggest things that it's been showing up with is in energy, because forever conservatives have been rightly complaining about how it's very difficult to build a new oil refinery. We haven't had a new oil refinery in something like over 40 years. It's very difficult in many cases to get permits to drill for oil and natural gas and things like that. But then on the left, they're starting to realize, like, wait a minute, it's also really hard to build windmills. And it's also really hard to build transmission lines to go from wind farms to population centers and things like that because of environmental regulations. And a lot of times it's the same environmental regulations that are blocking both fossil fuel projects and renewable projects. Quite frankly, I if I would like to see more of both. And I think we should be getting electricity and energy from whatever sources are economically feasible. And if there's government regulation getting in the way of that, whether it's renewable or fossil, we should be doing what we can to make sure that we get those hurdles out of the way and we allow for cheap and abundant energy, because that's been humans have spent a lot of time over history trying to get cheap and abundant energy, and it's been one of the things that's allowed us to have industrialization. It's been one of the things that's allowed us to escape the sort of Malthusian trap of poverty that most of our ancestors were in. And so, the historical significance of energy and of and if we are putting up barriers ourselves that are preventing us from maximizing that's really, really bad policy.
Well, and it's bad policy if one accepts that the objective of policy ought to be driving economic growth, driving human flourishing, driving these positive outcomes. If one is kind of epistemologically self-conscious about the fact that their objective is not economic growth, but is some particular social aim, I suppose at that point they can view the undermining effect of their own policy portfolio as acceptable. And that's one thing it seems to me is interesting, is that there's an ESG. I talked about this with a couple of guests more recently, but I'd love to get your take. It seems to me the ESG camp right now is divided between those claiming there are no trade-offs, and in fact it's a positive, and then those that are now saying there is a trade-off, but we don't care. We'll take the trade-off. Do you think that the latter, the acceptance of that what they're proposing produces an impediment to economic growth, do you think that is being caused by the Europe condition, the Russia-Ukraine reality, higher energy prices, even stock market sector attribution of the last couple of years? Or is there just kind of an inevitability of this realization because the former view was always so untenable?
I think it's definitely right to say that the laws of economics apply whether you acknowledge that they apply or not. And so to the extent that people were denying trade-offs, that was never going to be a sustainable view. But I think you point to something very useful in Europe. if we don't, and by we I mean Americans, but also just anybody that studies the economy and anybody that studies energy, if we don't learn from Europe's mistakes here, we are and do everything we can to avoid them, we will have missed a huge opportunity to really improve our understanding of what's going on. I think.
Let me interrupt real quick, Dominic. Do you mean in Europe, all of Western Europe, or is it country by country? France has embraced nuclear a lot more than some of the other major Western European countries. Am I right to say that German reliance on Russian fossil is a bit different than France because of nuclear? Are there nuances we want to hit up when we talk about Europe?
That's true. That's true. You know, Germany was the leader on this, and under the Energiewende from Angela Merkel, and the idea all along was that we'll use natural gas right now as a bridge fuel on the way to renewables, and we'll invest a ton in renewables, and we'll do that. And renewables were not ready for the actual electricity needs of a large industrialized country like Germany. And we should have known that. That was obvious. And so it ended up just being increased reliance on natural gas and now coal as well. So it's sort of going backwards in terms of environmental perspective. And Germany had the moral authority on this for a long time, and that does matter. It kind of seems sort of, squishy and practical. I don't know, but it really does matter that they were the ones that were getting praised in all these international organizations, that they were the ones who were, going out and giving these self-congratulatory speeches and telling the other countries of the world to follow them. I think that that kind of idealism that's totally separated from the actual needs of everyday people was just a huge mistake. And it would have been a mistake even if Vladimir Putin didn't invade Ukraine. But now that he has done that, it's even more of a problem because of the sanctions question and all the rest of that, and what are you going to do to stand up to this bully that's doing this stuff over there? And so that is, again, something that you could have said, well, nobody saw that coming, right? You can't plan around huge invasions that are not very, that's not a common event. That's not something that you usually plan around. But it puts into perspective that those kind of uncertainty, that kind of uncertainty exists in the world, and you do have to have in the back of your mind, well, what happens if something really bad happens? And that is something that you have to keep in mind when pursuing these sort of projects, because we know that we don't know what's going to happen, but we do know that there is uncertainty. And so I think that is a lesson that we should be taking out of this.
So when you look at the inadequacy of current American energy production, is your view that the primary culprit is executive branch, is social pressures, the ESG movement, the sort of I'm putting a lot of things together on this one, but what I mean by social is sort of the cultural milieu that is pension fund, bowling, the kind of Larry Fink, BlackRock factor, and even the kind of pressure on banks to cut off capital markets access to oil and gas. Is it that, or administration, executive branch, regulatory? Or is it number three, self-imposed, that the companies are overdoing a sort of rigorous capital discipline based on boom bust cycles of the last 8 years, and they are themselves stunting their own production output, perhaps for good reason, but nevertheless for their own economic interest. Is there one of those three that sticks out as the primary factor? And do you think that all three belong in the conversation?
Yeah, I definitely think all three belong in the conversation. One of the things about the government side of things is, of course, we can vote for different politicians and hope to get different policies. And I think we've seen that with energy between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. They take a different approach to people who think, oh, there's no difference between the two parties. They're all just, cheaters or whatever. Well, politicians do have these problems. They are, they are still politicians, but there is a real difference here between the way that the two parties approach administrative questions around energy. And I think that Republicans generally do a better job. As far as the ESG side goes, that's a huge part of it. The inability of some of these companies to get capital investment that they were hoping to get is a problem. No one wants to invest in building new refinery capacity. Now, part of the reason for that is the government regulation that makes it extremely expensive and next to impossible to do in the first place. But even if a lot of that got removed, you'd still have a hard time finding investment because of ideological objections on environmentalist grounds, but also on grounds of just the time horizons involved. So refinery investment will pay off over a time span of decades. If you believe that decades from now, no one will be using gasoline, well, you don't want to invest in a gasoline refinery. That's not a smart use of your money, if that's what you think. And so that is a problem as well. And of course, that goes back on the government side, right? Because if the government's going to be banning internal combustion engine cars in 2035, like California is doing, for example, if that sort of thing goes national or goes, larger than that, that's not a place you want to be putting your money. And then as far as the capital concerns from the business side, that is a thing as well. Earlier this year, there was a huge problem getting sand. It was a problem to get sand because sand is used for fracking. You mix water and sand and shoot it down into the earth in order to do fracking, which is, of course, how a lot of American energy extraction is done these days. And there was a sand shortage and there was extremely high prices for sand. So there was a lot of things where it was like businesses were like, hey, look, we'd love to be drilling for more oil, but we just can't get sand right now. And so that kind of thing happens as well. So it's all very complicated and layered. And a lot of it, like I said, has this sort of spiraling effect where the government does something and then that changes the expectations of business, and then that feeds into new expectations for the government and so on. But yeah, all of those are important factors.
How do you see some of this ending? And I don't mean ending in 50 years, 30 years, so not long game, but in the current phase of the battle, my view has been a bit more optimistic that some of the dynamics you're talking about with Russia, with the example of Europe, and I continue to make the point that there's a stock market performance reality as well, where the belief that one can invest in ESG, get the virtue signaling, self-congratulatory benefits, and get a performance premium is a very different story than when, in order to get the self-congratulatory virtue signaling, has to give up significant performance. We were in kind of the former for a number of years, I would argue, incidentally to market conditions, and we are most certainly in the opposite. What now is coming up on, in one more month, it'll be 24 consecutive months of a really substantial outperformance in energy versus things like technology and communication services and some of the more ESG-friendly dimensions of sector allocation. So I'm wondering if you feel that we're moving in the right direction. Or do you think that the forces are that are so powerful that right now the pension allocation censorship, the efforts to force money out of public markets and into private markets that fund oil and gas investment, not to mention the Larry Fink factor and so forth. I think a lot of that is very misunderstood, but I really know what people are saying. So I want to continue to talk about that kind of proxy activist movement that is looking to see oil and gas companies not be oil and gas companies, I guess. Do you think that the tide has moved in our direction, or do you think it's way too early to feel optimistic?
Yeah, I'd be cautiously optimistic. I think you were right when you mentioned before that there's increasingly a divide within the ESG camp, and they're sort of splitting themselves up into different groups. I think that that's an important thing to keep an eye on. And as they sort of fracture, the power, the institutional power of it will decline. I also think that it's just true that like you said, if the trade-off is increasingly between making money and virtue signaling, if those are seen as contradictory, a lot of people need to put food on the table and they need to make money. And so,
and by the way, I just want to add, I think a lot of people, it's not even about food on the table. They just want a higher return. They're self-interested economic actors, and in some cases don't have the option to not. Institutional portfolio managers, pension funds that have an IRR, a discount hurdle that is assumed. There just isn't necessarily the option that there was in the first kind of 5 years of ESG popularity, where it happened to be a momentum trade as much as a social virtue trade. And so, yeah, I mean, you're right. Mom and pop people, they got to put food on the table, provide for the retirement, get their IRAs and 401ks up. But I mean, at large, when you scale what we're talking about, I just think there's a whole lot of the loudest voices that never cared about what they said they cared about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another interesting side of this is, we had a good piece from Russ Green for Capital Matters talking about how ESG can function as a tax, essentially, transferring money from companies in the United States to companies in places like China and Russia and Saudi Arabia. Every company or every investment fund that gets wishy-washy about investing in ExxonMobil or in ConocoPhillips, that's great news for Saudi Aramco, because they're gonna take investment from anybody. That stuff's gonna keep coming in. There's a lot of state-owned oil companies around the world that are going to be doing better and better if the private oil companies in the West continue to decline. And so there's an aspect of that there as well that enters into more geopolitical concerns about, are we transferring power and influence to foreign state-owned enterprises? Is that a good idea? I think more people, especially as we see how energy can be used as a part of a war effort in Russia, I think that will become clear to people as well, and that even if you don't like oil companies in general, it'd be better off to not have it be state-owned enterprises in foreign and sometimes adversarial countries to be benefiting from this, instead of private companies on our own shores.
Yeah, and I would add, I think what the area you're talking about are the transfer of that power and economic opportunity to nefarious actors, to geopolitical rivals, that there is a foreign policy component, and also just environmentally, at best, it's counterproductive in any way you slice it. But Aswith, when we had him on Capital Record a couple months ago, pointed out sometimes we're not merely talking about U.S. powerhouses declining their own production capacity, and therefore that production on the margin gets made up by, let's say, Saudi Aramco. That a lot of the activists we're talking about are begging Exxon to go sell assets. So we're not even just talking about decisions made on marginal output, but the actual movement of assets that Exxon or Chevron may have to another player. And a lot of their assets are sold to other American energy companies that are just, maybe much lower market cap, much lower credit rating, much less capable of certain environmental and safety protections. So they can sell to foreign assets. They can decline production and have some of that market opportunity picked up by some of that market share picked up by foreign adversaries. And they also can just sell to a smaller player in the States who then, therefore, there's no environmental benefit and yet possibly an environmental worsening as the capabilities of the smaller companies are different than the resources an Exxon and Chevron may have in environmental stewardship.
Yeah, I think there's a great example of that in the efforts surrounding worldwide transportation policy. So the United Nations has the International Maritime Organization, which is the body to regulate ocean shipping. And they have put increasingly stringent regulations on ocean shipping related to their carbon emissions and things. Container ships burn bunker fuel, it's called, which is this really thick, nasty oil, and it is a significant source of pollution. That's why you see a lot of port areas have special air quality regulations, especially like we have those down in Southern California, because smog is a problem and all of that. But what the IMO has been doing is putting increasingly strict regulations on shipping, which means on the margin, what are you going to do? You're going to try to use other modes of transportation if shipping is not going to meet your needs. And on a per ton of freight, from that perspective, shipping is the cleanest way to move especially over long distances. But if you're going to take that option away because you're going to make it so slow or just uncompetitive relative to other forms or other modes, those other modes are going to pick up market share, and that means rail, that means trucks, where that's an option for substitution, and those per ton of freight have worse emissions. And so it's a great example of
worse emissions and worse spillage, and worse safety conditions. Yeah, exactly.
And so it's a part of it is unintended consequences from the IMO's actions, but it's not like they're unexpected consequences. It's not like there's something that we can't predict. We know that that's going to happen, and we should be working on making ocean shipping faster, more competitive, because it is really the best way to move 1 ton of freight a certain distance.
Well, I want to be able to close with a couple of thoughts on this subject we briefly alluded to at the beginning of the podcast about defending the market economy on the right. There is apparently a movement afoot that at varying degrees of intellectual honesty, intellectual self-awareness, and in fact, sort of intentionality around it. Many of the things I'm about to say, the proponents of this kind of new right view on markets would not disagree with it at all. I don't think I'm guilty nor want to be guilty of a straw man around their arguments, but there is a market skepticism. There is, in some cases, full-blown denialism, hostility. There's definitely a tension that has been created. You mentioned Burke earlier and I'm going to take for granted that you care about the synthesis that I do in a sort of Burkean idea of liberty and virtue, long held in the tradition at National Review by Frank Meyer and Bill Buckley and others, that they would now sort of view liberty as getting in the way of virtue and a market economy becoming problematic in the cause of other either political or moral or cultural aims. Many of those aims, ones I agree with morally, culturally, but the disagreement being that I don't feel market forces are the culprit when it comes to matters of societal virtue. Are you concerned about this movement, and what are some of your passing thoughts on the dynamic I described?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about ways that that way of thinking can sometimes be similar to the left's way of thinking on economics. If you take the issue of protectionism, especially, increasingly advocates of it are very open about the fact that it's going to result in higher prices. They accept that. It's a little bit like what we were talking about before with ESG, and about acknowledging the trade-offs and saying that they're worth it. And that is sort of an attitude that we've seen among some people calling for higher tariffs and various sorts of trade restrictions. And I think it should always be a red flag to anyone whenever somebody is promising through public policy to make you a little bit poorer for your own good. There's this sort of idea behind that is very similar to what environmentalists say, which is, sure, we'll make energy more expensive and we'll make it harder for you to get around through transportation policy or whatever that is, but it'll be worth it because we're saving the earth. And you have to ask, well, one, how confident are you that we really are saving the earth? On the trade question, how confident are you that you are really going to achieve the goals that you think you're going to achieve? And second, to just understand that governments in general, through public policy, are usually better at making people poor than they are at making people rich. Trying to plan that sort of thing top down doesn't work very well. It hasn't for a very long time. You can look at examples all over the world, and so if someone is actually being explicit about the making you poorer part, you should be really concerned because ordinarily they at least try to say, look, this is going to make everybody rich and it's going to be great. But if they're honest enough to actually know that it is going to make you poorer, that should be a huge caution. And I don't care if it's coming from the right or from the left. That should be something that should set off alarm bells for you.
Well, and I think that's a great place for us to close it. But I think you're exactly right that it's one of two problems, right? Either they know and explicitly state it will make you poorer and are leaning into this sort of power dynamic that asserts the desire for a kind of control over lives that is really quite frightening, or it is an economic ignorance where they don't know that what they're suggesting is going to lower economic opportunity for all. And I think that one is more nefarious than the other, though the consequences of both might be the same. And I bring this up a lot with students about income or wealth inequality and ask them to come up with some ways in which somehow we can make Elon Musk poorer without making anybody else poorer. And it's not so easy to do. And it changes the way people think about the supposed nobility of making Elon Musk poorer when they get to view it through the lens of what it might do to others. But Dominic, your writing on this stuff is fantastic. Your contributions and the war ahead are going to be vital, and I'm excited to work with you for the period to come. We share a common aspiration for this free society, and I thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for joining us, but I have to have you back because if we weren't out of time here, I could keep you on for another 45 minutes. We'll do this again sometime. All right?
Definitely, that sounds great, and I totally agree, David. And I'm glad to be part of Capital Matters and glad to be part of National Review. And I'm as glad to have you on my team as you are to have me on yours.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. All right. Well, we unfortunately kind of got a little rushed there at the end. I could have gone on more with things, but that tends to be a trend here at Capital Record. I'm hopeful that you got a lot out of that time with Dominic. Read his stuff. Follow him on National Review Capital Matters. For that matter, read and follow everything that is being put out by National Review Capital Matters. I think it is one of the primary sources for deep end-of-the-pool coverage of financial markets, of enterprise, of the world of business economics, finance, and policy. And for those who hold to the worldview that the National Review enterprise has promoted for the last 60-plus years, I really have to say that National Review Capital Matters is something special, and I hope you'll check it out. I hope you like this podcast, including the episode we just had. If you do, rate us, review us, and forward this podcast to your friends, and we will hopefully from that be able to continue climbing in our visibility, sharing the message of a free and virtuous society with all. Thanks for listening to the Capital Record.